A drive across the state can lead us to more Kansas stories than there is time to tell them. But one Kansan has compiled dozens of those stories and put them in the 2023 published book, Secret Kansas, a guide to the weird, wonderful, and obscure.
I was going to write about the goat gland doctor. You can't make up this stuff.
More on that story titled The Ultimate Quack coming up.
I thought about the Bloody Benders and I kind of cut them off the list because everybody knows about the Bloody Benders.
But then she had a second thought that perhaps not everyone knows about the Bloody Benders. A century before Dennis Rader, known as BTK, started his killing in Wichita, the Bender crime family killed in southeast Kansas. Between 1870 and 1873, the Bloody Benders, as they were known, killed an estimated 9 to 20 victims at their store near Cherryvale in Montgomery County. The Vanishing Serial Killer story on page 116.
The Pledge of Allegiance.
A plagiarized pledge is the story of how a Kansas youth didn't get proper credit for writing the Pledge of Allegiance.
And a 13-year-old boy wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. His name was Frank Bellamy from Cherryvale. He wrote it as a school assignment. Sent it off to the Youth's Companion, which was a huge magazine back then. And Francis Bellamy, no relation, decided, oh, I'm going to change one word in this pledge and I'm going to say it's mine. And so he went on to have all kinds of recognition as the author of the Pledge of Allegiance, which was a lie.
So for a century, the Kansas youth got robbed of proper recognition for writing the Pledge of Allegiance. Yonkey, who lives in Goodland, says often she would research one obscure story, which then led to information about another weird and wonderful story. Several of her collections have to do with health and medical stories, which may seem quite incredible by today's health standards. Now, almost all Kansans are familiar with the legendary TV show Gunsmoke. Well, the character Doc Adams was inspired from Dr. Samuel J. Crumbine, who began his practice in Dodge City. Author Yonkey describes how Dr. Crumbine was horrified to see a mother using a common cup to serve her child right after a man with tuberculosis drank from the same cup.
That is so gross. But they didn't think of it as gross then. They didn't really have an understanding of germ theory. No one ever heard of anything like fomites. Don't we wish we had never heard of them either?
So Dr. Crumbine went on a marketing campaign to ban the practice of drinking from common cups as a way to slow the spread of germs.
He stopped the common cup. He would have all these horrific posters about what happened to you if you drank out of common cups. He pioneered and pushed fly swatters.
Crumbine promoted swatting flies to curb the spread of disease. Yonkey says Crumbine also induced brick makers to make bricks with the slogan, "Don't spit on the sidewalk." A statue of Dr. Crumbine stands across from the state capitol building in Topeka. Another of Yonkey's stories can be a day trip exploration for most Kansans. She writes about the drugstore museum in Lincoln, northwest of Salina. Jack Crispin, a retired pharmacist, turned this former Lincoln drugstore into a museum showcasing the drugs, prescriptions, elixirs, and other potions common to the 4 decades between 1880 and 1920.
One of the ones that still bothers me was called Kill-A-Cold. And it was kind of this teardrop-shaped chlorine bomb. And you would break off the tip of the chlorine bomb and you would be gassed and it would kill your cold.
At least killing a cold is what the company back then said their device would do. The Lincoln, Kansas retired pharmacist says Kill-A-Cold was just another unproven medical practice from a century ago.
The way you were to use this is when you felt a cold coming on, you would take one of these into your bathroom, which was generally a very small room, stuff newspapers under the door to get a gas seal, then snap this open and breathe chlorine gas. The idea was that you would inhale the chlorine gas, it would kill the bacteria that was causing the cold, and you would stop the cold right away.
So why have we been suffering from colds all these years?
Because it didn't work.
I mentioned the goat gland doctor earlier, which Yonkey in her book calls the ultimate quack. Yonkey says Dr. John Romulus Brinkley got a bogus medical degree and started his practice in Milford in Geary County. Brinkley, she says, surgically inserted goat glands in male patients to allegedly cure impotence.
When he did all these surgeries and made all kinds of money, and he had a radio show. So his radio station was a media pioneer, KFKB, Kansas First, Kansas Best.
Brinkley, she says, pioneered talk radio, allowing listeners to call in and ask him medical questions on the air.
So you'd call in and you would describe your symptoms to him, and he would say, okay, you need love potion number 9, and he would go see Madam Ruth.
Brinkley lost his medical license after an investigation by the American Medical Association. He also lost his radio license and his fortune. J.R. Brinkley ran as a third-party candidate for Kansas governor, but lost. Yonkey writes about the ultimate tax protest about old Ulysses in far southwest Kansas. I featured the Grant County community in Kansas Ghost Towns Part 2 documentary. Yonkey describes how Ulysses town residents moved the town to avoid paying off bonds the town sold.
So they left the pathetic courthouse and pathetic school that those bonds had built, left the land that those bonds had paid for, put everything on rollers and hitched horses up to them and hauled it all down the road until they escaped that school district. Bye-bye bonds. Hello, debt-free living.
Yonkey includes stories like how Albert Alexander Hyde produced and marketed mentholatum from Wichita, and writes about the Kansas role in spreading the Spanish flu pandemic. The book includes the story of the planet hunter. Clyde Tombaugh grew up on a Pawnee County farm near Burdett, where he built homemade telescopes to study the night sky. The amateur astronomer later worked at the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff, Arizona, where he discovered the planet Pluto with the Lowell telescope. Yonkey writes of the discoveries of other Kansans like Jack Kilby of Great Bend, who developed the first microchip at Texas Instruments. That led to a technological revolution. Kilby was later awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work. She writes about Kansans who broke barriers, like Lyda Conley.
Lyda Conley was the first indigenous woman to argue in front of the Supreme Court.
Yonkey tells of how Conley and her sisters fought off developers who wanted to take their Huron cemetery in downtown Kansas City.
And the sisters' ancestors are buried there. Their parents are buried there. And the developers were going to take away their land.
The sisters built a shack on their parents' plot and lived there for decades, resisting developers' efforts to take the cemetery. And as Yonkey writes, the Conleys threatened death to anyone who would disturb them.
The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, Conley v. Ballinger.
Yonkey had to resist the notion that everyone in Kansas knows certain historical stories. The author also had to resist the temptation to not include some stories, thinking every Kansan knows their history. She realized some stories are known locally, but not by those in other parts of the state. The author includes locations to guide readers where they can visit and learn more about the subjects. So you might find a story or two in the book you know quite well. But there are enough stories, 84 in all, that you will likely learn more of the secrets of Kansas with this guide into the weird, wonderful, and obscure state stories. This is Chris Frank or Positively Kansas.